You think the only winner of Ukraine and Russia war is China?
Of course. Think about it. We are pouring our resources, our weapons, our money into Ukraine. Meanwhile, China, who is also taking resources from the US, is pouring those resources into Russia. So the US is spending money on the Ukraine side, and they're spending money on the Russian side. So whether it's Ukraine or Russia, it's American money.
What do you think? Who is stronger now, currently? Is it China? Is it the United States?
Yeah, clearly China's stronger.
Who are you, Robert Spalding?
Who am I? I'm an American that works on critical infrastructure. Spent my career in the Air Force and retired about 5 years ago to move to the private sector.
Okay, so I'm very excited to talk with you. I have so many questions. My first question is about how is it to advise the president of the United States on the China diplomacy?
Well, in particular today, I would think it's very difficult because the president has a lot of different people talking to him about China. A lot of people think, particularly business people or financial people, think that China is very positive and the relationship is very important to the economy of the United States. But if you're thinking about national security or foreign policy, there are challenges that affect the interests of the United States. And so, the president is hearing a lot of good things about China, and then you have to balance those good things with the challenges that affect the interests of the American people and the survival of the republic. And so I think it's very difficult, and certainly no different during the Trump administration when I was, in the military, but working in the White House, trying to be somebody that's going counter to the popular opinion about China, and certainly counter to what the business interests and the financial interests of the country are saying. So it's not easy. Let's put it that way.
So how it looks, you are getting in a room and you're saying, okay, let's talk about China. And that's the conversation. How does it work in real life? Because I see a lot of movies, I can't imagine in movies, but is it like the movies?
Well, so anything that involves foreign policy or national security policy in the United States involves a process that you go through to get to a policy recommendation that the president may make a decision on. There are 3 levels of policy making committees that talk about and think about and vet the various ideas and policy recommendations. It starts with what's called the Interagency Policy Coordination Committee, or sometimes the Policy Coordination Committee. And that is at the, in terms of the government, the federal government, the assistant secretary level. So a senior director, and I was a senior director at the National Security Council, convenes a meeting. Sometimes there's a question. What should we do, for example, about China and the islands in the South China Sea? What should be the response that the United States should take with regard to that? And so generally what happens is the senior director at the National Security Council assigned the responsibility to get an answer to that question would send a message out to the federal government, to the various agencies.
And all this is all this in secret, right?
Yes, it's typically done. It's not a public forum. It's done in government channels. And so they'll send out, typically it is a classified requests to have a meeting on this topic. These are who's going to be involved: State Department, Defense Department, Commerce Department, Treasury, FBI, the intelligence community. So, what the topic is, what the questions asked, and who's going to be involved. And then each of the departments will send a representative. In the Department of Defense, there's typically two participants. There's a Secretary of Defense's representative, and then there's the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs representative, and then each of the other departments send a single representative. And then the senior director convenes the meeting. They ask the question. They get the feedback. Typically, it starts with an intelligence briefing. Then the State Department usually goes next and talks about the foreign policy issue involved. And then once the meeting's over, there is some requirements or due outs by the different assistant secretaries. They will go back. They will talk to, in the case of DOD, they'll talk to the Secretary of Defense. They'll talk to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The next meeting will be at a higher level. It's called the Deputies meeting. That will be the deputy secretaries of the various responsible agencies. And, assuming everything moves forward in terms of the recommendation, the next meeting will be the principals meeting. This is the cabinet secretaries. The meeting is chaired by the National Security Advisor. And then if it gets to a policy recommendation to the president, then it's the cabinet secretaries and the president, and they make a decision. That decision then gets made into an executive order, typically, presidential order, and then that becomes policy. So it's a long process that can take many months, can take years, depending on what the issue is. So it's not like I have seen policy decisions made very quickly. Things like, what are we going to tell China about building islands in the South China Sea? Doesn't involve the president. Maybe it's the Secretary of State. These can happen very quickly. But if it's a substantial policy position for the federal government, then it can take months or years to get through this process.
Wow. And there is hundreds of people involved for one decision, as I understand.
Right, because each department and agency has people that are responsible for coming up the answer for the State Department or the Defense Department. And then all of those get combined at the National Security Council.
Do you think this process is effective?
I think for the most part, it's effective when there is not a significant change in the world environment. In other words, I think when you have certain periods of history where everybody knows kind of what are the main challenges, what are the main concerns. I think this is there can be long periods of peace in the world where perhaps there is no significant challenges, and I think this is what the United States faced after the end of the Cold War. But when you're entering a period of profound change or disruption, or maybe a black swan event where something happens that is totally unexpected, this is really where I think it becomes very, very difficult, because bureaucracies don't like change. They don't like disruption. They don't like, admitting that they don't really understand the world or understand how the world is affecting them. And so any bureaucracy is going to have a very, very difficult time adjusting to disruption.
Another question that I was thinking, do you think that, because you've been in those meetings, do you think the quality of the people are, like we're talking about, do you think is good, is maybe questioned, or do you think this is the best people of the United States and this is the people that need to be in those meetings?
Well, I think, particularly in the United States, certainly there's a vetting process for people that are invited into those types of meetings or that are appointed to those types of positions. But I think that it is generally based on the quality of people that are in government at any given time. I think what you see increasingly in the United States is that there's much more talent in the private sector because there's a lot more money, and so there it is the case that just like in every organization, there are people that are very talented and there are people that are not so talented, and they can both find themselves in positions of power at any time. They can be in a corporation, they can be in government. So it's not necessarily the case that every single person that's making or helping to attempt to make policy decisions on behalf of the United States is the best person for that job in the United States. I think that's the one thing that, I guess, when you take a step back and you think about the world and how things work, it's not surprising that you wouldn't have the best people at all times in those positions. But at the same time, I would think that the American people expects that the best people are there making, and I would think that for any country, they would think that the best people are making decisions, but that's not really the case. We all have examples of where good people are very talented people are participating in a business or in the government, but there's also not talented people. So I think it's a mix of both talented and not talented. I would not say that every single person is the best in the country and the most suited to making the decisions when you have to make policy decisions in the United States. Unfortunately, that is just the case.
Um, you are specialized in China relationships. How did you learn about China as an American? How did you understand China?
Well, there's really two parts to the evolution of me understanding China. The first part was getting to be a student. So I was a Air Force major. About 10 years I'd been in the Air Force at the time. I was sent to the Defense Language Institute to learn Chinese for a year. So by the time I went to Shanghai, I spoke pretty good Chinese. And then I went and lived in Shanghai for 2 years, studied at Tongji University, MBA classes in Chinese. So that was the courses I took. I really liked the negotiation, traveled the country, got to really understand the Chinese people. So I would call that the first part of my career of understanding China. It's not the end because I had other opportunities to go to China during this period after I left those 2 years and came back to the United States. I had policy positions where I was working on U.S.-China policy at the Office of Secretary of Defense. So I was working on an archive and an agreement to have access to the PLA, People's Liberation Army archives, for the missing dead from the First Korean War. For the Korean War. We're still looking for the remains of those people. So I worked on access to the PLA archives to be able to research where those soldiers and airmen and sailors and Marines were buried, so that we could bring them back home. And so, this was still kind of my first really belief that China was really good. It was a good relationship for the United States. It was very positive in that. And then there's the second part of my career where I worked for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, in particular worked on policy positions. And this is when China was building the islands in the South China Sea, and I started to understand better China, the Chinese Communist Party, more from the government level, not the people. And then I began to realize that the way that we had a relationship with China was creating problems for our own society and other democracies. And so this became the second part of my career, where I really began to understand the Chinese Communist Party and the government as separate from the people of China. And so, this process, I had experts like me that lived in China, spoke Chinese, understood the government, had worked in the embassy, for example, had worked on policy, and it became a process of understanding the Chinese Communist Party, how it acts, what it cares about, what's important to it, what it seeks to achieve in the world, and then began to realize that. The things that we think are important, the things that are in our own interests, are 180 degrees opposite from what China and the Chinese Communist Party wants. And so this became the second part of my career, understanding the government. So people first, then government. And I think overall, I began to understand that, as bad as the Soviet system was, the Chinese Communist Party system was just as bad, but they had studied the mistakes of the Soviet Union and embraced a lot of the strategies of the West to counter the Soviet Union. And because the West had opened up after the end of the Cold War, had been able to take advantage of globalization and the internet to begin to do some of the things that the Soviet Union wasn't allowed to do, because they weren't allowed to be part of the economy of the free world.
So can you describe me the Chinese party? You said 180 degrees against the United States goals. So can you explain me what does that mean?
Well, so certainly. So where the United States seeks to have free trade as and an open monetary system, and the idea around that is this idea that of specialization. One country may be good at growing corn, another country may be good at making steel, and so therefore, one country should grow corn, the other should grow steel, create steel, and then they should trade, and then both countries will be better off. This is the idea around free trade. And so I think the United States believes in free trade and has promoted that free trade system in many instances to the detriment of its own industries. So allowing other countries to come in and compete on a level playing field with American companies, and in many cases driving those companies out of business, but believing that overall it benefits the two countries to trade. And I think when I say 180 degrees, the Chinese Communist Party does not believe in free trade. They believe in dominating markets. And in dominating markets, it's not about the profits or competitiveness of companies. It is about the ability to control markets. And so that's just one example. There's a complete and fundamental ideological difference between what the United States believes in terms of markets and what the Chinese Communist Party believes. Another is
So,
go ahead.
so controlling a market, I'm not 100% sure if I understand what does that mean in 2023.
So what it means is you want to dominate the market. A good example is a market for rare earth metals, right? So, standard economics says that, if you're going to be in a free trade environment, then and there's no government intervention, then there's going to be competition, and some countries will do well, some countries won't do well, but by and large, there's going to be a balance. Today, China controls over 90% of the rare earth metal market. Why? Because they made a deliberate determination that was a strategic requirement. What does that mean? Well, that means that they can say, if you don't agree with something that we want, we can basically withhold the ability to have rare earth metals. So controlling a market means that you can use control of that market to control the geopolitics that you want. For example, another good one, pharmaceuticals. So China controls most of the precursors for pharmaceuticals. That means they can begin to withhold pharmaceuticals from a given country. So controlling a market allows you to have power over other countries that need the end results of that productive capacity in order to function. And so you can use that. This is how China was using their markets against Korea. They used it against Japan. They've used it against the United States. Lithuania is another good example where controlling markets is more of a strategic requirement. It's not necessarily something that would be where a company would do it on behalf of profits. It's done beyond just a profit-seeking motive. It's also done to have power over those that you have that need that whatever it is that product is.
And create future leverage for negotiations from scarcity and all these things.
Right. Another example is rule of law. Rule of law is something that liberal democracies believe in. In other words, every citizen is equal under the law, and the law is applied evenly to. And sometimes, the notion that the law is blind. In other words, the scales are balanced. China does not believe in rule of law. The Chinese Communist Party is the law, and so they will often get people. They will arrest them. They'll keep them confined for several months. They'll decide what they want to do with them. Then they'll hand them over to the judicial system, and then they'll be tried and sentenced and put in jail or executed. There is no due process. There's no ability for these people to appeal their decision. It is basically a mandate. It's very much like a monarchy where the king says, off with his head, and there is nobody to appeal to because the king is a judge, jury, and executioner. And so, rule of law is another one that is completely, different, between, say, a common, or not a common, but a democratic system and a autocratic system, which is what China has. So there's and you can go on and on about the differences in ideology between what the Chinese Communist Party believes and certainly the U.S. constitutional republic represents.
While you were explaining all these things, I was thinking that these things, let's say, might be morally wrong, or I might disagree with what, let's say, China is doing, but maybe all these things give a lot of leverage to China. For like when you control all the people of the country and they're scared of you or whatever, maybe you tell them do that and the millions of people do it. And or maybe when you are controlling geographically countries and they're scared of you, that you're going to be in a favorable position. So do you think the policies and the system that China is using is more strategic and better for the long term, for, let's say, for positioning themselves against each other in the future?
Well, I think that what we've seen typically, if you make two systems independent, one system is a system where people are allowed to thrive. They're allowed to seek their own future. They are treated equally. The government is actually serving the people as opposed to the people serving the government. I think when you have those two systems side by side with another system where the government has full authority over the people and the people are more subjects, not really citizens, I think you've seen time and time and again over history that the former does much better in terms of providing a much more productive, a much more prosperous, a much more successful, certainly developing technology, innovation, much better for people, and it's the way that people generally thrive. I think what China realized was that at the end of the Cold War, if the free societies were not going to restrict, the authoritarian system's access to the technology, the talent, the capital of those free societies, that they could begin to take those resources, take the talent, take the capital, take the technology and bring it over and make themselves stronger, and at the same time begin to influence how the population felt about a democracy or a republic, a constitutional republic, then I think they've been very successful at changing the outcome. So when they're apart, it's very clear that which system is better. When they're together, it is possible for the system that is much more top down and autocratic to thrive, because they're taking the resources from the free system, and slowly this system begins to go down and this system begins to dominate. And I think that's what the Chinese Communist Party realized, and I think very rightly so. It was smart. It was I say all the time that they did the right thing, in terms of providing for their continued dominance. And if we're going to allow them to do it, then of course they should do it.
I have so many questions. But so first of all, how do we prevent them from doing it? That's one question. But while you were talking, I was thinking about. So, do you agree that in couple of years, or do you think? What do you think? Who is stronger now currently? Is it China? Is it United
Clearly
States?
China's stronger in this system. I think the only way that you survive, if you're connected, you won't survive, because in order to protect itself, this system is not competitive with this system. All the entities, all the government, the corporate sector, the financial sector, they all work towards one goal, to one common end. This one is all working independently, and so this one begins to be dominant. And so, if they are connected, this one cannot survive. And so, in order to protect itself, it tries to become like this one. It tries to become more top down. It tries to become more authoritarian. It tries to align the means of production and power so that it can compete. And so in doing so, and able to be effective at competing, when they're connected, they tend to become the same. And so, because a centralized system is, when connected to a decentralized system, becomes much more powerful. And so the decentralized system must become centralized in order to compete. The only way to preserve a decentralized system is to separate and allow the decentralized system to grow. And the centralized system, when it doesn't have the ability to latch on and take the talent, the technology, the capital of the free system, then it begins to sink. And we're starting to see China now begin to sink as they become more and more disconnected from the free world. So I think this is the only way is to separate the two and allow the free societies of the world to thrive, to provide economic opportunity for their citizens, and to let the centralized systems fall into disarray and eventual collapse. I mean, this has happened time and time again, but in this case, they're connected. So that therefore China becomes more powerful, because we are not a centralized system. We cannot get business, finance, everything to work together to a common goal.
So, how do you identify who is stronger now? By GDP? Is it by what is the factor that we know who is stronger at what time?
No, I think today, if you want to look at who's stronger, I think take a look at a good example is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How many countries support Ukraine? How many countries support Russia? And what you'll see is there's a lot more countries that are supporting Russia than are supporting Ukraine. There's a few of the very wealthy Western countries, but by and large, the emerging market economies are all on the side of China and Russia. Why is that? Well, it's because China has made a deliberate campaign to basically use the Belt and Road Initiative and their economic strength to begin to create their own sphere of influence over those economies. And so I think when you look at power, it's comprehensive. It's not just economic, it's also geopolitical, it's financial. I think financially, the United States is a basket case. Now, China's not doing so hot, but the thing that China has that the United States doesn't have is that they have a insulated financial system. They don't have a currency that can be freely traded. Therefore, you don't have to worry about a collapse of the financial system because nobody can pull their money out of China. And so I think, financially, the Chinese, even though they have a lot of debt, how do you make that debt? How do you call it if you're a company or a country that exists outside of China? You can't. The Chinese have made that currency not convertible. So I think, productivity wise, it's clear who makes the most steel in the world. Who makes most of everything in the world? The Chinese do, because they've made that a priority of owning the industrial base. A lot of people thought the United States was the most powerful country coming out of World War II because European industrial base was destroyed. And so United States had an intact industrial base. Today, who has the industrial base? China does. And so I think when you look at kind of economically, productivity-wise, financially, certainly geostrategically, who has the majority of countries on their side at an international institution, China is dominant. Now, look at militarily. This is the one area where the United States has traditionally been dominant. China has a bigger navy. They have more rockets, more missiles. They have more weapons. They have more people that are in the military, and it's not just low tech stuff. They have the J-20. They have new aircraft carriers. They have new hypersonic maneuvering missiles and hypersonic or maneuvering ballistic missiles. So now they have high technology to couple with a lot of people in the military. So, militarily, economically, geostrategically, financially, I think you have to begin to say China is much more powerful in terms of its ability to get what it wants, what are its interests, and its ability to go out and get those interests in the international system than the United States is. Today, the luster, the allure of America, the soft power, all came because of the economic opportunity, the productivity, the ability to, for the citizens to thrive. All of those things have been undermined over the last 30 years. And so, now when emerging market economies look to a country and they say, what country is doing good? What country is providing for its citizens? They look to China. And so I think these are the things that, evidence that China is far more powerful in the world in terms of getting its interests met than the United States by far.
By far, wow. I thought of them as equals, and I thought of United States being slightly better, and like I thought that China will overtake. But you're saying no is different. So it's crazy. I wanted to ask you a question about the war in Ukraine and Russia. You think the only winner of this war is China?
Of course. I mean, I think the war in Ukraine is the repeat of the Korean War. Same situation. You have the North Koreans invade South Korea. They go back and forth, back and forth. A lot of people die. Pretty much nobody wins. Eventually, they have an armistice, and we're still there today. There's an armistice. There's no peace. I think the same thing's going to happen between Russia and Ukraine. Who suffers? The people of Ukraine, the people of Russia. Who benefits? The Chinese benefit.
So, but how much you think this war made United States less strong? Like, and how it made it less strong?
Well, I
Is it
mean,
by
you think
money?
about it. We are pouring our resources, our weapons, our money into Ukraine. Meanwhile, China, who is also taking resources from the U.S., is pouring those resources into Russia. So the U.S. is spending money on the Ukraine side, and they're spending money on the Russian side. So whether it's Ukraine or Russia, it's American money. One's going through China, one's going through Ukraine. All we're doing is spending money. And what happens? They go this way, they go that way, they're left to right. They are a lot of people die, a lot of people are suffering. But really, what's happening is the U.S. is spending money on both sides of the conflict. So, of course, the United States is losing because as long as we have a relationship with China, and China uses that relationship to support Russia, and then we give money to Ukraine, we're basically paying for the war on both sides.
Interesting. I have a question that I'm dying to ask you. Is how a war in 2023 or 2025, this age that we live, with China against United States will look like? Is it like, let's say, you can describe maybe militarily, like what are going to be like? Is it how it will look like?
Have you watched the movie The Terminator?
Yes.
Okay, so if they actually go to war, that's likely to be the result. The post-apocalyptic world of the Terminator. So I hope that there's no war between the U.S. and China because they both have nuclear weapons. And so what might happen? I think the Chinese are certainly going to conquer Taiwan. They're going to bring it back into the fold. And I don't think the United States is going to really be able to do much of anything. And if they do, it's nuclear war. So I think there's not a lot of good options here. Now, what did the United States do with regard to the Soviet Union? They basically threatened them. They said, if you go into Western Europe, we are going to just completely destroy the Soviet Union. That's going to be our response. And that is the way that they were able to prevent the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe, is just the risk of just having the entire society destroyed. If the United States is not willing to do that over Taiwan, then I think China is going to take Taiwan. And the response from the United States may be to try to attempt to save as many people in Taiwan as possible, to evacuate them from the island. But I don't think, at least I hope, that we don't go to war with China or Russia, for that matter, or any country that has nuclear weapons, because the implications, North Korea doesn't have that many, but certainly a Russia or a China, that could end up in destruction of humanity.
Are you afraid about the future?
Yes, I'm afraid for representative democracy. I'm afraid for the free world. I think that, in particular, the internet, as opposed to what we believed to be a general good for mankind, is particularly dangerous. And I think the ability to have access to somebody's data, their information, is in a way a kind of slavery. And I think unless we can find a way to liberate mankind from the slavery of open data, then it's very easy to subjugate them using their data. And I think that's what's happening in both authoritarian systems and free systems. I think unless we can get a handle on that from a technology standpoint, we are headed towards a world where corporations and governments control the actions of people, and people really don't have an alternative. They don't have a way to defend themselves in this kind of environment. It's been transformational, I think, since the invention of the internet and the development of this type of technology, to be able to understand people's intentions and then to turn around and use that technology to change their perceptions, change their behaviors, change their intentions in ways that are counter to their own interests, and in ways a lot of times that is imperceptible to them. So I do think that, I fear for society in the way that I grew up before the internet, in really believing that mankind had the ability to remain free. I don't know that we can actually maintain that going forward if we continue to have this world where your inability to have total control of your digital self is somehow instantiated in technology.
I'm not 100% sure what you mean by controlling of the data. You mean the country, the government control the data of their people, or you mean other countries control the data of other countries and trying to manipulate?
I think when your data is free for anybody to get, to aggregate, to control, because you give it away freely, or it's easy to access. In other words, it's not protected by encryption. So now, once I have data, if I know where you go, who you talk to, what you do on a daily basis, I can see you, your facial expressions. I can see how your body moves. I can see how you interact with the different things. If I can collect all that data about you, then I can understand, your emotional state. I can understand what you believe, and I can begin to then send you content that begins to change the way that you believe, or begins to manipulate the way that you believe. This is how ByteDance works. This is how many of the social media platforms work. This is how Amazon or Alibaba works in terms of making you a better consumer. And so we created these tools to understand data and then turn around and, using that understanding, begin to manipulate the emotions and the thinking of people. And this has been why Silicon Valley companies have become so economically powerful in the 21st century. But more importantly, now it's moving into the social and cultural space where governments and corporations can begin to manipulate the behavior of individuals. In this, when you think about that at a macro level, now you can begin to manipulate what they value. Do they value freedom? Maybe they're afraid of something, and so they don't value freedom. They want somebody to make them safe. This is a classic way that you control somebody. Convince them that there's something that they should be afraid of, and then they should look to you and do the things that you want in order to be safe. And this is a society that we're beginning to see arise, not just in China, where they have total control of all the media and social media and education system, but in the West, where there's a consolidation of narrative power. And so now you begin to see people really no longer thinking for themselves, but expecting the government or some corporation to begin to provide, the things that they need to survive. This is a thing that I find, terrifying, because, we've given up this idea of critical thinking and questioning, the stuff that comes at us, and saying, hey, it must be true. If the government's saying it, or this corporation is saying it, or this famous person is saying it, it must be true. And if they're all saying the same thing, well, then I must listen to them, because they're right. I must wear, masks. I must get a vaccine. I must, give up my business. I must close my business and not feed my kids, because it's important for the entire society. These are the things that you start to see happen when there is no ability to counter the prevailing narrative.
According to you, what do you think should be the role of a country?
It should be to protect the social, cultural, and economic integrity of the people. It should be to enable the people to thrive. And I think that's a really good question, because I think our founding fathers really struggled with that, and more importantly, they struggle with this idea of the constant state of humanity is this one where they're constantly fighting oppression. And why are they fighting oppression? They're fighting oppression because power is corrupting, and any system, any social system, any political system, the whoever has power seeks to keep the power to themselves, doesn't want to share the power. And so we created this, this power sharing system in the United States: the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. None of them had ultimate power. They all shared power, and they all had control over different aspects of our lives. But more importantly, because they had to share power, they couldn't become dominant over the people. So the people could maintain, so whatever rights were given to the government in order to protect the society, create, a financial system, create a military to protect, to create a legal system to protect the citizens. Whatever wasn't given to the government was kept by the citizens. And I think this is, I think a very, smart way to think about the world and the way human systems work. The problem is that we created this thing called the internet, and it wasn't accounted for in the Constitution, certainly. And so understanding the power of data to manipulate people's lives in ways that are imperceptible to them is something that was not accounted for in laws. And it still isn't. The Europeans try to do GDPR, but even GDPR is not successful at actually protecting the citizens against this kind of the consolidation and misuse of data. So I think that the government really exists to enable the society to thrive. You do need discipline. You can't have chaos. Otherwise, people can't thrive. And so you need to have a rule of law. You need to have a military. You need to have a financial system. You need to have markets that are competitive, not monopolistic. So and that in the course of the United States, that's been over 240 plus years of constantly improving the system. I think what's happened is, with these changes, these technological changes, the introduction of authoritarians through growth, globalization, and the internet has created kind of more a reversal of many of the benefits of that started really during the Enlightenment period, where logic and facts were used to make decisions, as opposed to superstition. And I think we've been on this ever improving and progressive path to making mankind better at so many things. And I think over the last 20 years, we've started to see a backslide, a reversal of that. And I think it is because of this inability to discern between fact and fiction, because the internet has corrupted this ability to clearly understand the difference between what's true and what's not true.
Interesting. Yes, it's an interesting question. Like maybe there is a lot of different government systems in the world, and it's like I was curious to hear your take on what should be the role of the government. So it's very interesting. But the question now that I'm thinking, after all the stuff that you said, so is United States destined for war with China, or you think no?
Well, I mean, I think it's important how you define war. If you define war in the classical sense, I don't think so. If you define war in the sense that war is more political in nature, we're already at war. We're at war with our own political system. We're losing. We're losing the ideological battle. I don't think, and I pray that we're not going to have a military conflict, because that could be devastating to humanity. But at the same time, I think what may suffer is that this idea where man could reach his true potential by defeating the demons that lead to this constant cycle of oppression. I think that may be the thing that suffers. I think we are headed towards a world that is far more oppressive in terms of the ability for humans to express themselves in the way they want, as opposed to the way they're allowed to. And so I think we have to we have to basically recognize that this is happening, that our ability to express ourselves is what's being taken away, and you're starting to see people, as they rise through the system, as they're born and they grow, they begin to self-censor, they begin to modify their behavior, they begin to conform in ways that I think in the end will lead to a very homogenous society. And a homogenous society doesn't innovate, it doesn't grow, it stagnates and becomes, it decays and dies eventually. And I think that's where we're headed if we don't begin to turn things around.
So I have a bit of a personal question. Like, what was your role exactly when you were in the military, as in the Air Force General? Like, what you did exactly? Because I understand what Air Force is, but like, what does the general does?
Well, so for most of my career, I flew the B-2 bomber. At the end of my career, I was more focused on strategy, policy, how to think about, how do we preserve this constitutional republic in the face of these massive changes in technology, in business, and finance? How do we think about preserving the principles and values of our constitutional republic in a way that is true to the ideals of America? And how do we maintain that in the face of these things? These are the things that towards the end of my career, I was much more focused on than flying airplanes. When I was flying airplanes, it was about learning how to defeat my enemies, to impose military force on a nation on behalf of the nation, to ensure that we could get some kind of political outcome. I think this is I've had two careers, I guess you might say, in the military. One was much more focused on the pointy end, and the other was much more on the cerebral side. How do we think about strategy? How do we think about policy? How do we think about economics and military force? When should it be applied? I think one of the things that you find in the military today is that there's a lot of people that are really interested in how to get better at breaking things or killing people. How do we be more efficient on the battlefield? But there's a lot less thinking about why are we killing people? Why are we breaking things? What outcomes are important? How do we preserve? What is the role of the military? How does it seek to preserve what is good about the Western civilization? And the Western civilization is good because it began to moderate the oppressive nature of governments over people. And these are the things that I think I've tried to, certainly towards the end of my career in the military, and now tried to focus on, is how do we preserve what we have, as opposed to breaking things or killing people. That's typically what the military is for. But in my case, I've tried to think a little bit broader.
But you didn't give me on a day-to-day basis, let's say on your end of your career. So you were studying relationships, you were like motivating the people of the Air Force, like you were giving talks.
I mean, I was part of the National Security Council. So when I was in the Joint Staff at the Pentagon, I remember I said, we would have these meetings. I was representing the chairman in these meetings. I was going back and I was coming up with the policy positions. I was working with my with the people that worked for me to come up with the policy positions of the chairman that he would recommend to the president. So I was thinking more of on the lines of strategy and policy and diplomacy. I was working with the Chinese People's Liberation Army, so their representatives. I went to be the defense attaché in Beijing. So much more strategy, policy, diplomacy in the end of my career, meeting with people, thinking about the challenges that we face and how we might come up with options to deal with them.
So did you fight in any battle or any war or anything that was dangerous?
So I deployed to Iraq. I was in charge of the protection for the prime minister, the president, the speaker of parliament. I was the head of this, almost like kind of like the Secret Service, I guess you might say, in Iraq during the Iraqi War. And then I was in command of the B2s during the Libyan War. And also I was going to lead the strike against Osama bin Laden when the president chose the SEAL. So these are the types of things that I participated in.
Interesting. So wow. So was it very dangerous at that and scary for you, and like how, or when you were there living all these things, how you were doing it for your country? What was your motivation? You were doing it because it was interesting. What was maybe you can bring those memories and recall some of them.
Well, I mean, certainly I've always been very patriotic. I believe in the United States. I believe in the Constitution. So that was something that motivated me. I really wasn't, I never really could say I was fearful. You always had your training and you always had your mission. So I really, not a lot of time to be fearful in many of the instances. I think the other thing is, you had people around you that were good people, and that you owed them your full dedication, and it was that camaraderie, I think. So combination of patriotism, combination of your training and your professionalism, and a combination of your desire to support your partner that was there with you. So I think there's a lot of, and then of course, if you were in command, the people that were under your command, you owed a responsibility to them, to their families, to ensure that you did the best to make sure that they made it home safely. These are all things that you think about. It's a challenging life, but it's also a good life because you meet a lot of really, really incredible people, and you do some very incredible things. And for the most part, I think it was I would do it again, and I would do it for all the right reasons.
Interesting. Did you be involved to any killing, any other stuff that you can share with us, or?
Not really. I was involved in wars, but I can't say that that was the major part of it.
Okay, so do you think the whole conflict in Iraq was well used by the United States government?
I can't say that. I mean, there's two ways to look at that. One is you have to think about all the Americans that suffered and put their life on the line, and I don't believe that they did that in vain. I don't think I would never say that that their lives were wasted in doing that. I think there was a belief that we were doing good. At the same time, I also recognize that the outcome maybe is probably not the best either for the Iraqi people or for the American people or for anybody else. So somewhere in the middle is where that answer lies. And I think that I think what I hope is we learn from every time that we have a conflict. We learn, and that we take that learning and that discernment, and that we at all times, in all cases, if we are going to apply force, military force, to achieve an outcome, that we've thoroughly thought about the people that will suffer as a result, and that we learn from it. Wars will happen, and conflict happen. It is part of humanity, but to the extent that we can learn from that and make sure that, for the maximum, for the most part, if you think about it, in most cases, war can be avoided if you really work hard. And sometimes I think maybe we didn't work hard enough to avoid it. There's a lot of motivations for why the countries go to war, and I think, hopefully, as we move forward, the tendency for that will get less and less over time as we learn, about the mistakes. I think the farther you get away from war, certainly the farther we get away from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think the less we're frightened of using nuclear weapons. I think the farther you get away from war, the more it might tend to glamorize it and makes it easier to slip into. And I think we should avoid those pitfalls and avoid those dangers, and constantly strive to try to avoid it to the maximum extent possible, because nobody wins. In the end, it's suffering.
And I think, as I read a book that actually Elon Musk recommended on his Twitter about Destined for War with China, he said the book is saying that the Chinese people have are more in the long-term view and on the defense side in comparison to the United States, that they are more in the attack side. Can you agree with that statement? Do you agree with that statement?
I think that's generally, I think of, probably the way to think about it. That being said, I also think that the Chinese. So when we think of China, are we thinking about the Chinese people? Or are we thinking about the Chinese Communist Party? I think that the Chinese Communist Party has its interests. It has its reasons for doing things. And I think those are oftentimes at odds with what the Chinese people may or may not want, if they really had the opportunity to think about it. But I think generally, in terms of, how the role China has played in the world over the centuries, I think it's been far more as an agrarian society that didn't necessarily venture out and conquer. In fact, were conquered many times, by many different countries, and then eventually it ended up absorbing those countries as part of what has become China. So, but I think the other thing about that book, this idea that a rising power and a declining power will tend to fight. I think that is that's it's not really doing justice to, I think, humanity and mankind in history. I think it's a trivialization of mankind, and I don't think it's easy to to put all of human history into this very kind of very kind of black and white scenario, like, I think 12 out of 14 times you had a rising power and a dominant power that you're destined for war. I think there's all kinds of reasons why two nations might go to war. I think one of the things that's different, I think it is critically different, is the presence of nuclear weapons and their impact on the decision of whether or not to go to war. So maybe we had 12 of the last 14. If you look at the at history and says this is what happened, But when we detonated a nuclear weapon, I think the world changed that day, and I think it's still changed. And I don't see anything that is going to deal with that change. And I think so. In the case of the United States and China, the leaders of both countries have to recognize that if we go to war, if we go to nuclear war, this is devastating for both societies, not just in terms of losing a battle or losing a war, losing humanity. This is what hangs in the balance. And so I think there is a difference here that we have to acknowledge, and that we have to hopefully understand and prevent from happening.
Wow. Yes, I just finished this book, and I think what you're saying it talks to a lot about history, and that this happened in the past, but we're living in a completely different world now. With the atomic bombs and stuff. So yeah, I think your point is it's very well thought, that it's different now because it happened in the past. Now the world will be completely changed if we have a third war.
Yeah.
So I have I'm thinking a bit more about the China's philosophy, but also the Chinese people. You mentioned that there is a disconnect between you mentioned what you mean what the Chinese people want or what the Chinese government wants. So I
Well,
want to yeah.
well, I mean, I
I
think
want
if you live in China, what you recognize is the schools, all the way from kindergarten to university, the media, the government, the businesses, the banks, everything follows one narrative, one line of reasoning. The Chinese Communist Party is most important. It's almost like a religion. And so if the Chinese people had an opportunity to recognize that there's something different, then I think that you would begin to see that they don't agree with the Chinese Communist Party, but they don't know that their entire life, from the time they're born until the time they die, they're only allowed to hear one message, and they've done a very good job at closing off the society to any other type of messages, like Korea, right? When people come out of North Korea, they're brainwashed. They have this idea of the world that's not it doesn't comport with reality. The same when you get people that come from China, they think a certain way, and they have a very hard time escaping that reality because they've been conditioned in this way. And so when I say the Chinese Communist Party have total control, narrative control over the Chinese people, and so it's hard to really say that, because when I was in China, they said, "Oh, we can't have democracy. Chinese people can't have democracy. They can't. It would be total chaos if China had democracy." And every single person I met said this. And at the time, I thought, okay, well, this is the way they think. But then, as you start to understand how their system works, and then you realize, okay, Taiwan is 70 miles off the coast. They've got a perfectly thriving democracy. They're Chinese people. So how can those Chinese people have democracy and these Chinese people can't? It's because what they're taught, it's what they're told, it's what what they're taught to believe. And so I think that is what I mean when I say the Chinese Communist Party tries to control what it means to be Chinese. They dictate what it means to be Chinese. I think if the Chinese people could have their own voice, that they may have some certainly different thoughts about what it means to be Chinese.
When I was in China, I was speaking with some younger people, and they were a bit more understanding that there is something going on here. So, do you think maybe in the future this will change?
I think it's getting worse. I think it's getting so bad. I mean, when I lived there the second time in 2017, they have so much control over the population, using cameras, using there's the fact that they can collect all the information from their phones. They do all their financial transactions with their phones. It's all digital. I think it's becoming much harder for the Chinese people, to escape the government watching what they do and then punishing them if they don't do the right thing. And so social credit score, all of that. I think it's getting far more easier for the government to control at the individual level, which is one of the reasons why I think it's so important in a free society that we have a separation between the data that the government has control of about you. Why I think the things that we did after 9/11 in terms of spying on our own citizens is so bad, and it's bad for any democracy. We should stop that, and I think every citizen at a basic human right has the ability, or should have the ability, to control their data, to encrypt that data, to make sure that only they have access to the data. I think that is a fundamental human right, and if we don't accept that, if we don't embrace that, then I think we're going to lose the benefits that of modernity, as at least in a way that Western civilization has enjoyed it.
Can you describe a bit the picture of what was the benefit for the government to see all the data and influence the data and act according to the data in the last couple of years after 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, you saw it. I mean, they were able to, like, if they said, okay, you can't go out, right? It's curfew. Okay, I see that person going out. Let's go arrest him. I mean, having that ability to know what people are doing, to see that and have that data accessible, I think is, it turns into, okay, I'm going to use that data for something. I'm going to use it to control the population. And then, as we've seen, the social media, we begin to say, okay, and even now, it's crazy. The New York Times was putting pressure on the White House to censor data, to tell Facebook to censor data, to tell Twitter to censor data. And so there's just, as you have data and the ability to understand what people are doing, this tendency to want to use that and to control the population is just, I think, overwhelming. It is exactly what the founding fathers said when they created our constitutional republic, is that if somebody has the ability to get power over something, then they will absolutely attempt to do so. And that's what's happening.
Oh my God. So you believe that power corrupts and is inevitable?
It is. I think it's it's a human failing. It is inevitable for any human to want to control their environment, and to the extent that they have the ability to, then they will.
Wow. So about the government role, so you believe the government role should be minimalistic, not doing everything and controlling all this stuff. Just be, but also before you said that they need to be prosperous and control. So I'm not sure where you draw the lines.
Yeah, I think for the most part, the government exists to make sure that we don't go to the extremes. Companies don't become monopolistic. People don't prey on other people. Your borders don't become invaded. I think, as long as people are operating in certain kind of, where they're not, we often say, my 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 rights extend from my fist to your nose, right? So as long as I'm not harming you, then I should be able to do, the things that I want to do. And I think generally the government exists to where people step outside of those bounds, where I start taking advantage of you, then the government should be there to make sure that that's not happening. And whether that be individuals, whether it be organizations, whether it be an organization to an individual or the government to the individual, I think there should be limits, and that's why government exists to prevent the excursion from those limits.
Do you think the president has power? Because a lot of times I heard that, maybe especially in the United States, is like you are driving a huge boat, but you have a small,
Rudder.
small thing.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I think the president has enormous ability to, they talk about the bully pulpit, the ability to use his or her voice to set the direction of the country. They run the executive branch. The executive branch is the largest organization in the United States, so I think they have enormous power. But I think that power over the years, I think what's happened is the legislative branch and the judicial branch have not, put limits on that power. So, over time, the executive government has taken more and more and more prerogative in terms of its ability to assert control over the population. And I think it's gotten out of a little bit out of control. And so I think, the legislative branch and the judicial branch have an obligation to limit the power of the executive branch, and so I hope that they begin to do that.
So I assume for your job you studied a lot of history, and what are some of the leaders you think of the past worth studying for young people like me?
So George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, I think are some of the leaders that I think were exceptional. Washington, many wanted him to be a king, and he absolutely refused. And he went back to onto his farm. He believed in this idea of a republic. I think Lincoln, believed in the republic as well, and really, suffered as a result, and ultimately gave up his life for that. And I think Grant, in his own right, he agreed with Lincoln in the importance of not punishing the South, to get reconciliation, to really build the United States, to make it better. And I think so. I think, from in terms of presidents, those are the ones I would look at. In terms of leaders of the United States, I think a great leader in the United States was Martin Luther King Jr. Just this great personality that rose above his circumstance, and really spoke to many generations of Americans on the importance of how we treat each other. And so that would be another one and then of course Christ is another one that I think of. And certainly when I look at the writings and the sayings of Christ, you see real wisdom in terms of how we should treat each other, and how we should, the types of lives we should live. So these are the people I look to kind of as leaders, and really example setters for how we should live our lives.
I ask every person in this podcast one question. If I give you $1 trillion, how do you use it to impact the world, or in a good way?
Well, I think what I've learned over the last 10 years is I would begin to work on the technology that surrounds us, and to ensure that people's lives are maintained privately, that they're able to control their data, and that they have the ability to live a life independent of influence from any corporation or government. I think that would restore the balance between. I would use every cent of that to restore the balance between individual citizens and the government or corporations, and make sure that we can get back to the true ideals of the American experiment.
So you are going to build a company that helps people control their data. This is what you are going to do with the $1 trillion.
That's my goal, to build technology that promotes the data privacy and data sovereignty.
And this is the company that you already have and started, right?
That's what I'm working on. Yes.
Can you give us a bit more on how you are doing that, or no?
Well, I think the way that we look at the world is today, data, particularly computing, is highly centralized. Our networks are highly centralized, and we believe in highly resilient, highly decentralized systems. And so, our company is focused on ensuring that you have connectivity no matter what happens, but ensuring that connectivity is gives you the power to control your information. And so we really have two um, uh, areas of growth, or kind of what I would call phases. We have to deploy the technology, which is what we're working on now, is to work with companies and governments and organizations that need secure, resilient data. And then as we become deployed, the ability to work with, even individuals to enable them to protect themselves from the misuse of their data, I think will be the second phase of growth. But as with any technology, it has to get out there. If it's not out there, it's very hard for us to be successful. And so we believe that resiliency and security is the reason that this technology should be there. And why resiliency? Well, you know, it used to be that we had a number of ways for announcing that we had maybe a natural disaster or some kind of military attack. We had something called a giant voice loudspeakers that said, that told people that something was happening, and gave them and let them know what to do. Then we had radio. Uh, Radio was a way that we let people know that where there was problems. Today it's the cell phone. And unfortunately, cell networks are not built to be resilient or survivable. They're very fragile. There's many ways that they can go. They can go down. We saw that there's a bombing at the AT&T switching center in Nashville, Tennessee, 2 Christmases ago that took out communications for several weeks for a lot of people, thousands of people. And so we believe that this ability to communicate is so vital to humanity that should be survivable. And the only way to really make it survivable is to make it decentralized. Highly centralized systems are very easy to attack and very easy to have an issue that basically makes them not work. And so that's our focus. And then as we begin to make our society more resilient and more secure, then we can begin to offer the ability to disintermediate this ability to collect data on people. And I think that's the second phase that we really want to focus on. And how do we protect people's privacy? How do we ensure that those cameras aren't being used to control them, but rather are used to maybe protect them, but not by revealing who they are or what they're doing in ways that are counter to their privacy and data sovereignty.
So now with the artificial intelligence rise of all these articles and everyone talking about it, what is your take on this topic?
Well, I think artificial intelligence is incredibly dangerous if not properly controlled and regulated. It's I think I agree with Elon Musk on this, and I think that artificial intelligence can be a wonderful tool for mankind. It helps you identify cancer, or helps you improve transportation, make things more efficient, make your power more efficient, help solve problems that humanity has struggled to solve. But at the same time, I think it can get to a point where it surpasses mankind's ability to understand or control, and then it can become very, very dangerous. And I think intelligence in the wrong hands, and certainly at the wrong level, can be incredibly oppressive.
So do you think AI is maybe the weapon that will give a bit of advantage in United States in comparison to China?
Well, I think that since there are a lot less kind of controls, I think in terms of how China might use artificial intelligence, I think they have the advantage. But that also could end up backfiring on the Chinese Communist Party. Who knows? It could lead to their downfall. They embrace artificial intelligence. They think it's going to give them an advantage over the United States, or certainly over their own people. And then who knows? Maybe it turns on them. So I don't know. I don't know it's kind of hard. Ray Kurzweil, who writes the singularity is near. He talks about the event horizon. Where it's impossible for humanity to see past the point where an artificial intelligence system has general intelligence that's better than a human. At that point, we cease to be able to see the outcome of the future, because we can't contemplate what that intelligence may create. And that's the point where I think we have a very, very difficult time understanding what happens next. And so I think it does come with some kind of threat to humanity, at least what we know of it.
So you don't think the United States has advantage with artificial intelligence? You think
Not
China
today,
has?
No, I think China does, yeah.
Wow. Another advantage that China has, as you're describing. So you mentioned about the data storage. You mentioned about the so all this. Are you using artificial intelligence, or do you think artificial intelligence is going to be used in the specific area that you are describing for data encryption and all this stuff?
Certainly. I mean, our intent is to use it to be more resilient, more secure, more efficient, and then also, the types of applications that are designed to run on our infrastructure is more aligned with artificial intelligence. So, just one basic example. If you're monitoring, something, and you are looking for anomalies, most of your data is benign. You may have a couple of things that happen. Say, it's livestock, and you've got 100 cows in your pasture, and 2 of them are sick. The data you care about is on those 2. You don't care about the 98. And so today, all that data gets sent back to a centralized data center to process. I think what you're going to start to see is the ability to process that at the edge, identify what data you want, identify what data you don't need, discard the data you don't need, and then keep the data that you want. And that is going to slowly make you more efficient, allow you to make better decisions. It's certainly going to reduce the amount of power and energy we expend on processing. So by making us more efficient and more capable, not only are you going to make those jobs get better outcomes, but the amount of energy that you need to expend. These hyperscale data centers that take enormous amounts of water, they take enormous amounts of power to make them operate. So by creating these nodes that exist much closer to where the work needs to get done, and allow that work to be done, then you start to see, you're using less energy. That's better for the environment overall. So it is generally, we believe is going to be more environmentally friendly. It's going to allow us to have better outcomes faster. It's going to reduce the amount of data that we collect and store. So, this is the type of thing that I think, where artificial intelligence can really make a difference in how we think about the world as it exists today. We've been very focused on the smartphone as the kind of the end all be all of our current age. I think in the coming age, it's going to be a lot less about the smartphone and a lot more about individual sensors and devices that are allowing us to collect data on things and then be able to do things and accomplish things that we can't do today.
I heard again Elon Musk talking that as time progress, data centers become more and more and more of importance, because it's like when artificial intelligence we store all their data somewhere and all this stuff. So, what do you have any thoughts on how do we prevent with decentralization? How do we make data centers more about? Because you mentioned decentralization and data centers, I was curious to hear what's your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think, if you think about the world, just from the perspective of water, you have tributaries that lead into rivers, that lead into, or streams lead into rivers, lead into the ocean. I think these large data centers represent the ocean. And I think that there is something to be said for being able to deal with data when it's in the tributary, and not have to wait till the time it gets to the ocean. I'm not saying that data centers aren't going to continue to remain relevant and important. I think that there is a combination. There is, certainly a need for being able to process at the edge, and then I think there's an importance for a data center. And so I think they work together, and they make the system more efficient and provide better outcomes. I don't think it's going to replace. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's actually, instead of 1+1 = 2, I think 1+1 = 3. You actually have a better system that's a hybrid between centralized and decentralized.
I'm very curious on how all this experience that you had in the army, being advisory for the Chinese relationship in the government, apply to you. All the skills that you learn apply to you on leadership and you're starting your company now.
Well, I think what I would say is that it's been very difficult for me to adjust to this different system, different circumstances, different situations, different relationships. I think I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is that you have to be persistent. You can't give up. Sometimes I remember reading something that said, the startup that succeeds is the startup that doesn't fail. Well, not failing actually is something that it comes from being persistent, about not giving up, not quitting. And I think that is a lot of times people, and certainly I would say this, and this is the case in business. It can be very, very lonely. It can be very, very hard. It is. I've worked harder than I've ever worked before in the military, and I worked hard in the military. So I've had to learn a lot of lessons, and I think the main lesson is be persistent, be true to what you believe. Don't People will try to change you and say, hey, this is not right or that's not right, but you have to stay convicted, and you have to continue to persist. And I think that's a lesson that I think is good for anybody in whatever they're doing, is just this idea that you, every single day, you get up and you go after it again, and you don't give up, you don't quit. And it's not always going to work out the way you want, but certainly you can't give up.
So it was a difficult transition from the public sector to the private sector.
Oh, absolutely. And I would say that, initially, when I was thinking, I could get out and do this business thing, um, I had I was not as prepared as I thought as I was going to be. You have to, when you are in a career, over the years, You gather, what I call your clue bag. You fill up your clue bag. You learn, what you learn these lessons, and then as you become, more and more experienced, you're able to make decisions a lot easier, and they're good decisions. And then you go to a completely different area. You have nothing in your clue bag, and so the way you fill up your clue bag is by making mistakes and learning from them. And unfortunately, there's no other way to do it.
So this experience, in a way, humbled you, as I understand. Again.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
So I see. I was curious. In what do you find in going to all these podcasts? Because over the years, it's been a lot of years that you are going and presenting your message. Why you find this interesting?
It's not that it's interesting. It's I owe an obligation to my country, to the Constitution, to Western liberal democracy. I think it's important that it survives. I think it's important that we continue to advocate for a meritocratic system. That we advocate for these things that so many people died to preserve and protect and to grow and to nurture. And so I don't do this, because it's because of me. I do it as a way of giving back. I've been so blessed in this country, and I owe my kids, I owe my grandkids, I owe my fellow citizens, for that, for having to grow or being able to grow up in the system. And I want to give back. And I see a threat. I see a threat to our society. I see a general lack of willingness to fight for this, and I think it's good. I think it's a good. It's not the best system, and I do think it has problems, but but I think it's something that we should be fighting for a lot harder than we've been fighting for. And so I do it because I think it's important. That's the reason I do it. I do it even when I'm tired and don't feel like doing it, because I think it's something that we have to do if if this type of dream that is America, and living this type of life is going to survive.
And last question: what do you want to leave behind in this world?
I want to leave behind my kids, that they hold allegiance to the same type of ideals that I grew up with, and I hope if they have kids, that they will leave behind the same type of ideals. And I think that's the only thing that anybody can expect to have. That's is to leave behind citizens, good citizens that seek to make good in the world, and hopefully that will be the case.
Oh my God, I want to really express my gratitude and thank you for everyone that was watching all the way through. We love you and thank you for spending your time, for your beliefs. And yeah, I feel that all the stuff that you shared is honest, that your intentions are honest, for because you believe that you're helping with your actions. So I really feel the honesty in your words. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.